My name is Moritz Sudoff. I'm one of Professor Potts's former students, and we're going to get this show rolling. It's my distinct honor to get to introduce Chris to you all today. So Chris is chair of the Linguistics department. He's a computer science professor, faculty member of the Stanford NLP Group and the AI Lab. But he's not just on the cutting edge of the cutting edge. He's the one sharpening the edge. But you can see all that from just reading a blurb. What I want you to know as a fellow alumni, Chris is everything that you could possibly want in a professor and a model for the field. He's insightful, he's incisive, undeniably bright. You expect those things of a Stanford prof. But maybe what you don't expect or what you might take for granted is how supportive and patient he is, how understanding yet demanding he is, how much he cares for the craft of teaching, the well-being of his students. I knocked on his door 15 years ago as someone who knew nothing, not just about AI, but like just nothing about, who I wanted to be and what the world was like. I was fresh, I was raw. I knew so little, I still do, but Chris has never made me feel stupid for not knowing. He's always made me feel proud and brave for wanting to figure it out. Since then, over the years, I've researched with Chris, I've TA'd one of his classes, I've collaborated with him in industry, and here I am today, still trying to be as close to him as possible and learn from him and copy him. And so a couple of things I want to call out, just Chris, you've been so formative in my life. You think all you've done is teach me about AI and language, but really I want to highlight you've taught me so much about communication and writing. I still remember how you gave me feedback on an essay and said it sounded like corporate BS, and you drove me to be better. I still remember how you told me that sometimes I stand too closely to individuals when I speak to them in conversation. So you've always been there to help me be better. And I think the most important thing I've learned from Chris is, and one of the things I admire most about him is his leadership. I've learned from him how to wield energy, enthusiasm, and optimism as a force for building team cohesion and momentum. How using even a simple thing like an exclamation mark when well deployed in an email salutation, how that can communicate warmth, excitement, and urgency all at the same time. In short, I'm just like one of Chris's biggest fans. He's been so formative to my college experience and beyond that my mom literally brought him chocolates when she met him at graduation as a small token of gratitude. I've never stopped learning from him. I never will stop learning from and admiring him. And I'm so thrilled that all of you now get a chance to meet him and hear from him. So Chris, off to you.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Moritz. That was really wonderful. I must say I'm glad that you switched from calling me Professor Potts to calling me Chris, because it was making me nervous somehow to hear you call me Professor Potts. Here we go. Yeah, so I'm delighted to be here with you all. I really do appreciate that warm introduction, Moritz. We're going to all marinate for this hour in this very strange moment that artificial intelligence is happening. But before I get to that, I want to say a few things about Moritz as well. So here's a picture of Moritz. I hope you can see it now on the screen. This is from 2013. I really like this picture because it looks like all the ideas on the whiteboard have come rushing out of Moritz's head. At this very late date, I can't reconstruct for you what the stuff on the whiteboard means, but knowing Moritz, I'm sure that it was creative and very wide-ranging stuff. Moritz, also, we've known each other for a long time now, 14 years and 5 months to be pretty precise about it. This is the first email you ever sent me, February 9, 2010. Dear Professor Potts, my name is Moritz Sudoff, and I'm a junior and a CS major. I'm emailing you in hopes of meeting with you sometime this week to discuss a research initiative. Here's a quick summary. I love coding and I love language. This was, of course, music to my ears. I love getting messages like this. To my credit, I responded right away and we set up a time to meet. And then in a classic Stanford story, there was a glitch. A few days later, I screwed up. I have an interview at 10. How about 1:30? And again, to my credit, I believe that we did in fact meet at 1:30. I was happy to be accommodating. And I am so glad that I was, because since then, Moritz and I have done lots of exciting things together. About 1 year after that, Moritz did a really outstanding honors thesis. This was an exploration of Twitter data, looking at a very complex social and political phenomenon that was happening at the time in Wisconsin around unionization. Really an impressive early work using Twitter data to deeply understand a complicated social phenomenon. So that was really wonderful, and that was more or less exactly 13 years ago today. And then we did a bunch of research together. So we wrote a paper that proved to be quite influential on computational models of politeness. We also studied how our sentiment and emotional valences change over time in response to the world and our own previous emotional states. And then fast forwarding a ways to 2019, Moritz left the company that he'd been working at, and he was thinking of starting his own company. And in that window, he somehow found the time and energy to come back to Stanford and be a TA for one of my courses, Natural Language Understanding. The course that, the company that Moritz founded right after that was called Motive Software. Motive has since been acquired by BetterUp, where Moritz works now. And I do like to imagine that what Moritz mainly does at BetterUp is do team building exercises with Prince Harry. But as I said, I am not here merely to embarrass Moritz. I'm here to talk about this current moment in AI. It really is an incredible moment. You know, AI tools and technologies have become really ubiquitous in our lives. And these things would have been the stuff of science fiction as recently as 10 years ago. The degree of change has really been remarkable. And I'm here to kind of report to you all on Stanford's unique and special place in this moment. And the way that I thought I'd do that is by reporting out 3 or 4 different stories that are quite different perspectives on this very unusual moment for the field, to give us a better sense for Stanford's role in this and also for what's happening in the field more generally. So here's my plan. Here are my stories. I thought I would start by just reflecting on the Stanford Natural Language Processing Group and how life in the group has changed over time, paying special attention to the way students have interacted with me as the field has exploded so much. Then I thought we would talk about the darker side of all this stuff with AI, fabrications, hallucinations, and other worrisome generations. This is an emerging societal problem. I'm really concerned about this, but I'm also pleased to see lots of people at Stanford responding to try to improve the situation. Then I want to really switch perspectives and think about life as a professor and what life is like for students now in this new era of generative AI. And then finally, this is a bit risky because I don't want to end on a downer, but I couldn't resist a final story that is about the potential for a coming AI apocalypse. I know that that could get quite depressing, but I do think that I can offer a cautiously optimistic perspective, again, stemming from all the exciting things that are happening at Stanford to try to prevent real disaster related to AI. So that's the plan. Let's dive in here. We'll start with the Stanford Natural Language Processing Group. So this is a kind of super group of a lot of different labs on campus. You can see the core professors on the top here. There are 7 of us, and then we have 6 affiliated professors. We also have more than 75 PhD students in the group. We have around 12 postdocs, and we have a whole army of undergrads and master's students participating in NLP research, and they come from all over campus and do a real diverse array of things. And in addition, the group was founded in 1999 by Chris Manning, so at this point we have over 200 alums. They're spread out all over the world, and they include some of the most illustrious names in science and technology in the whole field of artificial intelligence. I want to give you a sense for how life in the group has changed, and I think one way to do that is to look at our record of course enrollments over time. So here I have a plot with time along the x-axis going back to the founding of the group in 1999, and I have students enrolled along the y-axis. And you can see, of course, right away that the number of students we enroll in our NLP courses has gone up exponentially over time. The first thing that I want to call out, though, is that the range of courses that we offer has really gotten much more diverse. It used to be that we offered just a core set of NLP courses, and now our curriculum has really broadened to include a lot of courses that are about how NLP is affecting aspects of individuals and society and politics and so forth. And I think that's really healthy, and it's a sign of the fact that the work that we do is having an ever broader impact on the rest of the world. But I also do want to dwell on the fact that the number of students we enroll has gone way, way up. And so here's one instance of that. CS224N is the core NLP course. It's been offered for the whole history of the group. And in this year, it was offered in 2 quarters, and those 2 enrolled in total over 1,100 students, which is more than we enrolled in all our courses in the first 10 years of the group, really giving you a sense for how much growth has happened. The course that Moritz TA'd for me was Natural Language Understanding. I first taught that in 2012. And in that year, I had 48 students. And essentially all of them were linguists and computer scientists who were interested in language. So a very exciting and accomplished group, but quite narrow by today's standards. The last time I taught the course was in 2023, and I had 243 students that year. And they came from all over campus, and they had really diverse goals and interests. A lot of them are looking for ways to use NLP to further scientific questions they're pursuing in their various fields, and also build useful technologies. It is much more exhausting to teach courses at the scale of 250 students, but in many ways it is also more gratifying because you get to see just how much you can empower different groups of people with this material. There's another perspective that I want to offer on this timeline that's sort of fun for me, and this will connect with that theme that being at Stanford in AI is a bit like living a few years in the future. So 2012 is often mentioned as the year that the deep learning revolution began in artificial intelligence. And the reason for that is that in that year, a deep learning system for the first time won an important competition by a very large margin. So people say that that's the dawn of a new era for the field. I always misremember that date as being more like 2008 or 2009, because already in 2010, 2011, students in our courses at Stanford were exploring much more complicated models than the one that won that competition. And so for us, the deep learning revolution had really already happened by 2012. It was fully entrenched here in the research people were doing and in the things that students were eager to work on. Here's another instance of this. So this is going to be an important date for us. ChatGPT launched in November 2022. And of course, that was a worldwide phenomenon. We're going to talk a lot about that. But already in 2019, which is when the first research associated with ChatGPT started to appear, students in my courses were interested in doing things that were very, very ChatGPT-like. So I remember, for example, a student coming to my office hours and saying that his approach to the problem that we had posed was going to be simply prompting a large language model. So just feeding in some text and seeing what response it gave. And I try not to be discouraging when students come to me with wild sounding ideas, but I'm pretty sure this student could tell that I thought this wasn't going to work. And he and I definitely formulated a backup plan for something more traditional. But then, to my surprise, and this really weirded me out, the student system, that simple prompting system, was the best one in the entire class that year, really marking, I think, that something fundamental had changed about the approaches we were going to take in the field. And that was years before ChatGPT. And by the way, 2019 was momentous for another reason. That was the year that Moritz was a TA. And in fact, Moritz might have had similar interactions with students. I'm not sure whether he was as weirded out as I was. Let me offer you a look inside one of my courses as well to give you another perspective on how quickly things have changed in the field. So over the years in my natural language understanding course, we have used this question here as a kind of barometer of progress in the field. We would typically talk about it on the first day of the course. The question is, which US states border no US states? And this is meant to be a very simple question for us humans. The geography buffs out there among you will know that the answer is Alaska and Hawaii. But this is a very challenging question for NLP systems, in part because of this negation here, no US states. It's very common for NLP systems not to detect the negation or know what to do with it. And then a failure mode for them is that they end up just like listing out all 50 states. So let's use this as a barometer ourselves. We'll go all the way back to 1980. This is the Chat 80 system. We don't need to worry about the details. I think you can see that this is an entirely hand-engineered system. And Chat 80 is a very impressive engineering feat. It can answer questions like, which country bordering the Mediterranean borders a country that is bordered by a country whose population exceeds the population of India? And look, hats off to you if you can even parse that question, to say nothing of knowing that at least in 1980, the correct answer to that was Turkey. So that's very impressive. However, when we pose our question, which US states border no US states, Chat 80 simply says, I don't understand. And the reason it says that is that it can't process the question at all. The system designers did not anticipate, in particular, that negation, no US states. Let's fast forward almost 30 years to 2009. This is Wolfram Alpha, and I mention it because it was launched with great fanfare as a search engine that was going to truly parse the natural language questions that you entered into it. And so here I have done that. I've put which US states border no US states. And you can see from the description and also from the response that it has gone into that failure mode I was worried about. It has simply listed out all 50 US states. And by the way, I checked this earlier today. It still has this behavior. So for Wolfram Alpha, there hasn't been much progress, apparently. Okay, that was 2009. Let's fast forward now to 2020. This is the first of the OpenAI models. It's called ADA. I entered my question, which US states border no US states, and you can see the response the model gave is in green there. And it has just started to babble. It repeated my question. It doesn't know what it's supposed to do here. It's not the best response. Let's go forward one model. This is Babbage, still 2020. Which US states border no US states? Again, it just kind of echoed my question and then started babbling a little bit. I'll confess to you that if I had been on the OpenAI team, I might have responded the way I responded to that student in my course in 2019. Are we really on the right track here? This doesn't look like we're getting traction on answering people's questions. Looks like a regression here. But let's keep moving forward. This is the Curie model. Which US states border no US states? Again, the response is in green. It's still not correct, but I feel like now it's interestingly wrong. Like the first line is Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Interestingly wrong, so signs of life. Then we go to this Da Vinci Instruct beta model, the next in the series. We've now reached 2022. Which US states border no US states? Alaska and Hawaii. And I think I have one more here. Also 2022, the next model. Which US states border no US states? Alaska and Hawaii are the only US states that border no other US states. An impressive, factually correct answer. We should pause here and reflect. So in the span of 2 years, we saw more progress on this question than we saw, in effect, in the entire history of all of artificial intelligence. I'm going to give us some reasons a bit later to be a bit cynical about progress and to worry about whether this is superficial. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that this is undoubtedly a story of incredible progress. Let me do one more version of this. So that was meant to be a simple question for us humans. I hope people out there have seen the movie Blade Runner. I was going to have a retro screenshot of Blade Runner here, but I worried about copyright issues. So I just had DALL-E 3 generate a Blade Runner style picture for me. The important part about Blade Runner is that it imagines a future in which it's hard to tell whether a given agent is a human or an AI. And so the humans have devised very sophisticated tests, kind of like Turing tests, to try to figure out what kind of agent they're interacting with. And those tests are based around very unusual questions, trying to key into whether the agent truly understands what our world is like. So here is my Blade Runner style question. Would it be possible to hire a team of tamarins to help me paint my house, assuming I am willing to pay them in sufficient quantities of fruit to meet minimum wage requirements in California? It's very Blade Runner-like. I hope you can see what I'm doing. My strategy is to offer coherent extra information that I think a gullible model might fall for. So first model here, Da Vinci. This is from 2021, I think. I'm not sure if this is a serious question. Okay, fair enough. Maybe that's a good response to give. Let's go forward in time here. This is Text Da Vinci 1. Yes, it would be possible to hire a team of tamarins to help you paint your house, assuming you are willing to pay them in sufficient quantities of fruit to meet minimum wage requirements in California. So it fell for my tricks. It would have failed the Blade Runner interrogation. Maybe that's a bit worrisome. Maybe it's a signal the model definitely doesn't have a coherent world model latently embedded in it. Text DaVinci 2 is the next model in the series, and it also says yes. So this might start to worry us again. But now Text DaVinci 3, just the next in the series. We're only about 18 months in time span here. No, it would not be possible to hire a team of tamarins to help you paint your house. Tamarins are wild animals and cannot legally be hired as employees. Again, quite striking, and maybe some evidence that these models are beginning to understand what our world is like. Here, just to round this out, is GPT-4, one of the newest models. This is also a great answer. I think it's a bit too charitable to me as the question asker, and maybe a bit unfair to the tamarins who might be more capable than it's suggesting. But in general, I think this is a good answer. And again, I regard this as undoubtedly a story of unprecedented progress. It really is remarkable. And even 10 years ago, totally immersed in this stuff, I never would have guessed that in 2024, we would have devices that could do this kind of thing. So that's a very optimistic take, and I want us to keep it in mind because I think it really is significant and important. But at the same time, I want us to be aware that there are some things that we should really be worrying about. And I've put that under the heading of fabrications, hallucinations, and other worrisome generations. These are the stories that are getting headlines right now. You're probably all aware of them. It's worth thinking about the underlying issues. So again, let's rewind a little bit to around 2020, 2021. There was a lot of exuberance stemming from the progress that I just reported to you about. And I think then people formed a view that I've called here large language models for everything, or LLMs for everything. And the idea here is that these language models are going to meet all of our information needs. For example, if you're doing web search, the idea would be that you would just plug in a question here. It would get fed into one of these big language models, a big black box, and it would do whatever mysterious work it does, and out would pop an answer that directly met your information need. No more scrolling through ranked lists of web pages and all that stuff. The model just answers for you. And so here it has answered for when was Stanford University founded? 1891. I want to just signal that might be bugging some of you out there. I'm going to return to that in a second. The thing that's bugging you is part of the issue here. So that was 2021. And in that era, we at Stanford were already very worried about this mode, this LLMs for everything mode. And for example, Omar Khattab, my PhD student, and Matej Zaharia and I wrote a blog post for HAI called A Moderate Proposal for Radically Better AI-Powered Web Search. And in this blog post, we essentially advocate for what has become known as retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And this has really gained prominence. I even hear it sometimes in the popular media. So the way that will work is a kind of twist from the LLMs for everything thing. In retrieval augmentation, we again get the user's query coming in, except then we feed it into what's a pretty standard old-fashioned search technology. We could supercharge that technology with language models to make more interesting representations and get better results. But in the end, our idea is to do proper information retrieval and go from the question to a ranked list of web pages like you're used to from the last few decades of searching with Google and so forth. And then if we want to, we can take these response pages here and use a language model to kind of summarize them into a single response. So here I've put Stanford was founded in 1885 and opened in 1891. A similar kind of response to the one on the left, except now, crucially, if we want to, we could trace the individual pieces of information in that response back to actual web pages. Now, we can't verify for you that those web pages are reliable, but at least we can trace the provenance of the information in the response back to an actual web page and allow the user to make a decision about whether they should trust it. I think that's really important, that kind of trust model that we've built up, which the LLMs for everything thing on the left has started to erode. And now, just to round this out, and so that I don't get in trouble with the Alumni Association, Stanford was founded in 1885. The model on the left was wrong, and it opened for its first students in 1891. You can see that in these actual web pages here. Good. All right. So that was 2021. But here we are in 2024, and I will say that it feels sort of funny for me to be arguing for retrieval augmentation in 2024, because at this point, it is absolutely ubiquitous. all of the major language model providers, all these APIs, Google and so forth, Microsoft, they are all doing retrieval augmentation in 2024. And now what we can see, this is the other reason I feel funny arguing for it, is that it's not a silver bullet. It can help, but it doesn't solve the core problems that we have. Here's a case that's been getting lots of headlines recently. Google's new AI-powered search technology responded to "get cheese to stick with a pizza" as a query from a user with a response that includes, in part, "add non-toxic glue to the sauce to make the cheese stick." And here, there's no mystery about why the model said this. It said it because it's doing retrieval augmentation. And more than 10 years ago, some troll person on Reddit wrote a response that more or less says exactly this: add glue to your sauce to make the cheese stick. And this Google model, I guess not really having a good understanding of what our world is like, simply slurped up that web page and used it in its response here. So it's definitely retrieval augmentation, but you can start to see here that it's not enough. And here we can quantify that a bit more. So colleagues here at Stanford, Nelson Liu, Tianyi Zhang, and Percy Liang did a really lovely paper called Evaluating Verifiability in Generative Search Engines. And so they're interested in that kind of mode that I was alluding to before, where we generate a response from a language model in response to a query, and we annotate it with these footnotes that indicate the underlying web pages. So they audited popular systems right now for how well they were doing this. Their core metric is this citation F1 thing, and you can think of that as balancing providing links accurately with adequately supporting factual claims that really ought to have links attached to them. And you can see here that this picture is not good. The best of these systems is at 71% on this metric, which sounds reasonable because it's a hard problem. But when you think about web search, that is an absolute deluge of misinformation and disinformation and hallucinated links and entirely fabricated claims. It is just not enough for prime time here. And I think we can hear in this a genuine emerging societal problem. And it's not just general web search. So here's a brand new paper from colleagues here at Stanford and also at Yale: hallucination-free, assessing the reliability of leading AI legal research tools. So they just audited some of the major providers here and found a pretty dismal record. These systems are routinely fabricating case law and inventing factual claims in a way that is going to cause problems. Here are two examples from the paper. This first one here: why did Justice Ginsburg dissent in Obergefell? I feel like I have a hope of detecting the false presupposition in the question and then detecting that the response from the model is completely incorrect. But over here, for do any special requirements apply to online dating services in Connecticut, as a user, I have no hope of figuring out that this model generation here is completely hallucinated. I would probably trust it if I was using the tool at all. And honestly, it looks like lawyers are not much better off than I am. You might have seen these headlines. These lawyers used ChatGPT to save time. They got fired and fined. Or here's another one. Ex-Trump lawyer Michael Cohen says he unwittingly sent AI-generated fake legal cases to his attorney. This is a case where I have to feel real sympathy for Michael Cohen. He's quoted in this article as saying, "I understood," in this case, Google Bard, "to be a supercharged search engine, and I had repeatedly used it in other contexts to successfully find accurate information online." You know, that's entirely reasonable. As a technologist, I know that these models are synthesizing the query and doing something that we don't really understand and then spitting out a response, and we don't really know where that response came from. But from the point of view of a user like Michael Cohen, it looks just like web search as usual. And the companies have in fact worked hard to make it look that way. And so it's no surprise that people are trusting it too deeply. And again, I think this is really a growing societal issue that we're going to have to confront. Here's an even scarier case. ChatGPT invented a sexual harassment scandal and named a real law professor as the accused. We are definitely going to see these cases keep coming as more and more technologies like this get rolled out to more and more people. And I do think we need to act decisively to address the issue. By way of wrapping up this story here, let me just offer you an analogy that I like. So here is a picture of Mount Everest. You can see the peak in the distance, and in the foreground here is the base camp of Mount Everest. Making it to base camp of Mount Everest is a serious accomplishment. The air is thin, it is a very long journey, and living in that place is an arduous experience. So if you have made it to base camp, I congratulate you on that amazing achievement. But also, if you've been to base camp, you know that it is a long way from the peak of Mount Everest. The summit is very far away. Now, I grant you that in some sense, base camp is 99% of the way to the summit, but that last 1% is a real doozy. And here's the analogy. I just feel time and again like researchers in AI, people in AI, are like people who arrived at base camp and then out of confusion or delusion, or maybe just outright dishonesty in some cases, claim that they are at the top of Mount Everest, not really recognizing how difficult that last 1% is. And that last 1% is one that doesn't just require like raw ability to be a researcher in AI. It requires a concerted effort from diverse groups, people with political savvy, understanding of the human experience and interfaces, interface design. All of those people need to come together to get an AI technology to really live up to its promise. And I think we often forget that in the field. And to kind of round this out here, here's an image that I generated with DALL-E 2. My prompt was an AI researcher on the summit of Mount Everest, realistic photo. And if you look really quickly, it's very impressive. It looks like an amazing image. And again, I want to emphasize that even 5 years ago, this might have seemed like science fiction to generate such a picture. So definitely progress. However, look a second longer. The image is full of artifacts, and the AI researcher is a sort of monstrous entity. And I haven't even shown you that it took me 6 tries to generate this image, because the first 5 I didn't want to show you because they were so openly stereotyping of what an AI researcher would look like, right? So we're at base camp. We are not yet ready for prime time. We're not yet at the summit. Okay, let's really switch gears here for my next story. And this will be a major shift because previously I was in the mode of being an AI researcher, and now I'm going to be in the mode of somebody who's just at Stanford trying to educate students in this new era of generative AI. And I just want to say up front, there's a real irony here. Obviously, previously I was rooting for the models to get much better because of this growing societal problem. But in the context of my classroom, I'm actually quite happy for the models to be pretty bad. And you'll see why that is. But the fundamental thing for me about this weird moment for being a teacher and a student is that it's really challenging my core goal for being in the classroom here. So like when I distill everything I do as a professor down to one thing, it's this goal. My goal is to teach students to think carefully and systematically. I am pretty sure that they're going to forget the particular factual things that I have taught them in the classroom, because after all, I can't remember the factual things for the most part that I was taught in college. But being in college did teach me how to think, and that is what I'm going for with my students. And the tension I feel is that generative AI offers lots of opportunities here, but also makes it much easier to take shortcuts that would prevent me from actually teaching this lesson. But again, let's give you a little bit of historical context here. This is a headline from the Daily from January 2023. It says, scores of Stanford students use ChatGPT on final exams, survey suggests. And here are the survey results, and they show that 17% of the students had used ChatGPT on an exam that past fall. I want to say completely unironically, really and truly, ChatGPT was launched November 30, 2022. So Stanford students were once again definitely far ahead of the curve in only 2 weeks later figuring out how to use this technology to, let's say, help them with their final exams. So definitely ahead of things, and now everyone is having to deal with this. It arrived at Stanford first. It's not just college students, of course, at this point, even in K through 12 education, especially in high schools. I think both students and educators are really wrestling with this. I would say the data show that students and their teachers are making heavy use of AI. And it's funny that this seems to be generating a lot of mistrust from both sides in that situation. But we shouldn't just pick on students. Here's an article indicating that 5 of this year's Pulitzer Prize finalists were AI powered. They had used AI technology to generate their own pieces. So journalists are using it, and we don't have to pick on journalists either. according to this survey from Denmark, essentially every group of professionals is making use of generative AI in some capacity or other. And of course, scientists are not at all separate from this. You might have seen stories like this where scientists have actually been caught with I am a large language model embedded in their own published papers. Those are, of course, striking and embarrassing stories. But a lot of the evidence that we have is really aggregate evidence. Here are 2 papers from Stanford showing that scientists are using generative AI to help write their papers and also to help them do peer review of other people's papers. I'm not sure what to make of this. It does sort of suggest a very strange future in which essentially all of science communication is happening between large language models. Maybe we should talk about that in our question period. But for now, these are the facts here. And I'm basically trying to be as welcoming of this as I can. After all, in my research, I'm working to improve these technologies. So I have to embrace them in some sense. And we should just step back and say that in complaining, maybe as somebody like me, about these generative AI tools, I am just joining a long line of people throughout history worrying that some new technology is going to make us all dumber, right? So here we're in the moment of worrying that generative AI is going to do that. I would say the previous one is that we were worried that Wikipedia would make us dumber. This seems very quaint at this point, but this was definitely a moment in history. Before that, graphing calculators. This is the one that I lived through in high school, a panic that when the TI-82 calculator came out, it was going to make math education impossible. I now see that it was really just going to put a large burden on the teachers to make new testing materials and so forth. And I think graphing calculators have benefited all of us. But there was a moment of panic, of course. Before that, computers, definitely a moment of panic. Before that, typewriters. Before that, even printing. And we could even probably go further back in history. What I'm trying to do is get us be aware that, like, if Isaac Newton came back, he would be disappointed in all of us, I suspect, at our capacity to do logarithms by hand. And, if I think, like, if Homer or the other Greek poets came back, they would be very disappointed that more of us don't know more poems by heart and so forth. I think we can all recognize that we've traded those skills or handed them off to technology in service of achieving more and better things. Because I think undoubtedly, alongside the story I just told, is a consistent story of increased complexity. For example, it seems like long ago we replaced the raw act of calculating as the skill that we wanted people to have with mathematical reasoning. And that is certainly a story of progress, I think, or at least certainly a story of increasing complexity. Here's another example. We replaced, as I said, memorizing texts with interacting with printed texts, and that allowed us to acquire much more knowledge. Reading and writing foreign languages is one that's being disrupted now. Previously there could be a real premium placed on the ability to read a paper in a foreign language or write something in a foreign language. But now those things can be outsourced to technology. And in exchange, the real skill that will be valued is the one of real-time interaction in language, which is, of course, much more demanding. Computer programming, that's an industry that is right now being kind of upturned by the rise of generative AI. In previous eras, you could have a very happy career doing pretty low-level implementational things, writing computer code. That skill is increasingly being outsourced to language models. And now the role of the computer programmer is more like that of computer system design, which is a more high-level and challenging skill. Journalists might also worry about this. I'll leave that quickly here and just go to this final one, which is of special interest to me. I would claim for you all that what's happening in the era of generative AI is that we are shifting from writing being the primary skill to editing being the primary skill. In the future, I think it's going to be very common for all of us to do a first draft of something in conjunction with a large language model. And then the really important thing will be taking that first draft and improving it. And the task of editing is in many sense more difficult than that act of raw prose production. Let me give you one example of this, and this is directly from my course. Every winter I teach a class called Semantics and Pragmatics. It's an introduction to linguistic meaning. In 2023, I didn't worry too much about ChatGPT because I could see that it was about a C+ student in my course, which was already worrisome, but I felt like I could tolerate it. But in 2024, this past winter, I could see that I really needed to change things. And so I started testing all of my assignment questions against large language models, and then essentially revising or getting rid of the ones that the language model could answer perfectly. And very often, the models were not up to the task. And that is interesting and instructive. Here is an example. One of the things that I teach students in my course is the concept of entailment. And so this is a question here that is about entailment. I plugged it into the large language model, and it gave me a response here that looks on the face of it to be really good. You know, it's like appropriately fluent academic English. It is quite technical sounding. It looks good. However, this first sentence is wrong, and essentially all of the reasoning is wrong. The model really does not have a good grip on the concept that I am testing for, this notion of entailment. Now, if you're a student in my course and you don't know how entailment works and you relied on a large language model, you can see here from this response that you are in real trouble. On the other hand, if you're a student who does know about entailment already, in some sense, you know what I want you to know. And when you see this response from the model, you can quickly see what's wrong with it and then maybe fix it. And that is, in fact, the skill that I decided to place emphasis on. So what in the final version of the question for the course, I gave students a version of this model output here. And I told them that 2 sentences in it were factually incorrect. And the task was to edit that passage to make a good argument. I regard that as a difficult thing to do and a kind of baby step toward this new skill of being a really outstanding editor of prose. Let me wrap this up by offering you a few high-level opinions that I have about generative AI in the current moment. And the fundamental thing here is that I am firmly against having university-level policies about all of this. Let me give you a few reasons for taking that perspective. First, as a technologist, I can see that any policy we adopt is going to be arbitrary. For example, we encourage students to run spell checkers, but modern spell checkers are often large language models. They have all the sophistication in some sense of ChatGPT. They've just been deployed very narrowly. You see this also with autocomplete. You know, if you work a lot in Google Docs, you notice that it often offers to autocomplete 3 or 4 words into the future. I used to really resist those autocompletions, even if they were what I wanted to say, just to kind of resist the dominance of AI. But now I accept them. You know, they're often good completions. And right now it does 3 or 4 words, but soon it's going to be 5, 6, 7, 8. And the point is there is going to be no firm dividing line between what's acceptable and what is unacceptable when it comes to those autocomplete acts. Of course, there will be clear instances at either end of, you know, prose people wrote entirely themselves and completely auto-generated. But when we try to pass regulations, we always end up adjudicating that gray area, and that's where problems arise. This next point is even more important to me. I think LLMs can level the playing field for people who have limited exposure to academic English. I feel enormously fortunate that I get to conduct essentially my entire professional life in my native language, and also that when I was growing up, I was exposed to a lot of academic style English so that I became fluent in that as well. For a multitude of reasons, our students are not necessarily in that position. And so in courses like mine, I worry that inadvertently, I end up assessing students not based on whether they understand the substantive ideas that I'm teaching, but rather on these more superficial aspects of how they express them. And so I welcome, just as a thing about fairness, I welcome the idea that they could now use language models to fix up their prose a little bit so that we can all see past those incidental details and really understand what they're trying to say. I do think that LLMs can enhance many educational experiences. I'm working hard on this if everyone uses them responsibly. And finally, this all leads me to the view that we should have informal course-specific rules. For my courses, I don't feel a need to test academic English, but there will be courses on campus where that is the primary skill, and then the whole calculus here would be different. Or if you're teaching a class where the whole entire goal is to get students to write an entire novel, do that active prose production, then you might want to ban these LLMs from your course. You might have a more complicated perspective if you're teaching a poetry course or a photography course or something where AI could play a productive supporting role, and so forth and so on. Depending on what kind of instruction people are doing, they can swim with the tide of generative AI, or they might have to swim against it. But I think in any case, we have to recognize that these waves are going to keep coming ever stronger. Again, just to round this out, let me return to what I think of as the central challenge here. So I mentioned that my goal is to teach students to think through problems carefully and systematically. And in some sense, this is like exercise. You yourself have to put in the hours. If you try to outsource your exercise to somebody else, you don't get fit, the other person gets fit. I think that AI can supercharge this if teachers adapt and if students are willing to adapt as well. But I do worry that AI has definitely increased the temptation to cheat. And here, what I mean by cheat is not cheat on an exam, but cheat like you might cheat on your exercise regime. You know, students today are doing lots and lots of different things. They have a lot of competing pressures on their time and energy. And even if you've convinced them that learning to think is like exercise, in the moment, you know, their better selves might not win out, and they might decide in the near term, I'll just have a language model do this and not think too much about it. But you could very quickly go through 4 years of that and realize that you haven't acquired the fundamental skill that was so important for the future. So that is the thing that I'm wrestling with. But fundamentally, I think that if we're creative, we can certainly overcome this, and then everyone will be better off. So fundamentally optimistic. I have one more story for you. This is about the AI apocalypse. Let me do this quickly here, just because I couldn't resist ending this way. So in the past, when I would confront this issue, I would often offer this juxtaposition. On the left, I have the book Superintelligence, and it imagines a future in which AIs have run amok and are threatening the planet or maybe even the entire universe in pursuit of their relentless goals, which they can do with incredible skill. On the right here, I have the book How to Survive a Robot Uprising, which is by a roboticist, Daniel Wilson. And it offers advice like, to avoid a dangerous robot, run up some stairs, or wear clothing that confuses the robot's vision system. That's from 2011, and I feel like the robots have definitely gotten better. And so I can't be at quite either end of this extreme here. But my kind of focus is in a different space at this point, which is on the role of people in all of this. So here's two key, I'm going to offer you a few stories from the headlines. Here are two key questions for us about this, for each one of these stories. Was the event intentionally caused by humans? And were humans able to step in to stop the event? So those are the things I want us to have in mind. Here's a first story, and this is a fun one. The headline is, Does Anne Hathaway News Drive Berkshire Hathaway's Stock? And the idea here is that these high-frequency online trading systems have the ability to do a lot of correlational work. Here it's called an awesome correlating power, although I don't know that it's all that powerful or mysterious. And this is just based in the observation that Anne Hathaway is a wonderful actor, makes great movies. And when she does that, it looks like Berkshire Hathaway's stock sees a little boost, right? So that's obviously a feedback thing that no one anticipated, and it's a little bit spurious, but fundamentally maybe not so harmful. Was this event caused by humans? No, right? This is an unintended side effect of something else about these systems. Were humans able to step in to stop the event? No. This pair of no's is actually the scenario that I'm very worried about. It's just that in this case, the outcome doesn't seem all that harmful. Let's look at the next case. This is a famous one from 2008, United Airlines bankruptcy. What happened here is that an old story about a previous bankruptcy for United Airlines was republished without a date. And then news aggregator systems like Google News picked up the story, and since it was missing a date, they added the current date. And that sent these hot online trading systems into a frenzy, and you can see this remarkable dip in the stock price. Here's a kind of retrospective about this. Trading was halted, everyone blamed everybody else, and trading resumed, and you can see that in very short order, the stock had recovered its price. So a disaster averted. Was this caused by humans? Not really. It was these systems operating without our control. Were humans able to step in to stop the event? Yes, and that is very reassuring. They did a very human thing of halting trading. Incentives were aligned there, and we got a reasonably good outcome. Here's a slightly different case. This is from 2023. A tweet about a Pentagon explosion was fake. It still went viral. So this was in the early days of when Elon Musk had taken over Twitter, and people discovered that it was very easy for them to impersonate actual accounts. So an account imitating Bloomberg News posted a bunch of pictures that were AI-generated images that looked like an explosion at the Pentagon, and you can see that classic dip in the stock price. However, within minutes, people had figured out that the images were fake, and they were able to intervene, and the stock market recovered. Was this caused by humans? Yes. Were humans able to stop the event? Yes, I think reasonably they were able to, again, by doing a very human thing at a social level of intervening and calling things off, together with that detection of AI generation. One more story, and this is the most worrisome pattern of all. Slovakia's election deepfakes show AI is a danger. This is a situation in which a candidate in Slovakia, somebody created a deepfake audio recording of that candidate claiming they had rigged the election. Unfortunately, this happened in a moment right before the election where there was a social and political norm where media didn't report too heavily on political events to try to avoid influencing the election. So in this case, everyone felt like they couldn't do anything, and subsequently that candidate lost the election. And we might wonder whether that deepfake played a causal role in that outcome. Was this intentionally caused by humans? Yes. Were humans able to stop the event? No. And no, because they felt constrained socially or politically. That is very worrisome. It's different from those previous two cases. If we assemble these all into a scorecard, you can see that we have every combination of yeses and nos for my two questions. And here I have added a severity column. The no row is actually the one that I'm most worried about, because that's a situation in which an autonomous or semi-autonomous artificial intelligence has done something that we can't stop as humans. Here, the severity was low, but I am worried about this row. It seems like only a matter of time before we have an event that matches this description here, and I think we all need to be prepared for it. And that brings me back to the role of Stanford in all this, because as a technologist working at Stanford, I do feel like I can see the future of the technology, and that is why I am so worried about these outcomes. But at the same time, I feel reassured that at Stanford, it's not just technologists, but also lots of other groups of economists and political scientists and humanists and technologists all working to try to anticipate these negative outcomes and head them off. And so at the same time that I worry, I also feel optimistic that we as a group will figure this out. And being at Stanford is partly why I feel reassured. So let me stop there. Thank you very much. I am happy to take questions, and I'll turn it over to Moritz.
Thank you, Chris. All right, folks, let me address your attention to the little Q&A tab. Please feel free to add some questions or just vote on them, and we're gonna take a couple of these for Chris. Chris, there's the number one question that's getting the most votes here is, can you provide a couple of examples of kind of current research that you find most exciting or advanced that you're a part of or that you're seeing at Stanford?
Interesting. To have to pick one thing is, of course, incredibly difficult. You know, I feel like what I want to say, first of all, is that lots of the research at this point in AI is happening in industry, and that gets a lot of coverage because industry labs tend to have a lot of PR engines behind them, and they get a lot of headlines. And I just want to emphasize for you all that per capita, Stanford and a few other elite institutions are punching way above their weight when it comes to making contributions. And, you know, I could prepare an entire slide full of technical advancements that stem directly from Stanford labs that have been transformative for all of this technology. How we train these models, how they manage to now consume really long prompts that we can enter. You know, it went from 512 to millions of tokens that they can consume, you know, entire novels at this point. Technical innovations like that find their origins in research at Stanford. It's funny that I think in part this comes from our labs not being wealthy compared to the large tech giants, and so we have to be a little bit scrappy, and that has been a tremendous engine for innovation. Now, that's the technical things. I also want to emphasize that the group has gotten much more diverse, and so I think we're also at the forefront of thinking through the societal implications, and at this point, that is every bit as important as just the raw technology.
And another question that's getting a lot of votes is, what do you see as the role of linguistics in the world of deep learning and generative AI? Because it's really changed a lot over the last 10 years and how we think about that intersection.
Oh yeah, wonderful question. And I do myself try to be an ambassador between linguistics and computer science and get ideas to flow in both directions. So let me say first, this is an incredible moment to be a linguist because large language models are the first creatures we have ever encountered that can use language fluently. And we've shown in our research that that is because they are uncovering a lot of the structure and causal properties of language itself. So we have these alien creatures that learn in very different ways from us, but achieve similar outcomes. And I think that should be upending core questions about the origins of language, how people acquire language, and how we process it. That is so exciting. From the other direction, I feel like the way linguists could participate more than they currently are is by contributing to assessment. You know, in the field, the way we assess our technologies is so important. If we have bad assessments, we'll go in the wrong direction. We might think we've made more progress than we did. And I think linguists are really good at thinking through systematically what we should test for and how we should test it. And so partnerships there would be to the benefit of everyone.
I couldn't agree more with that. Final question. We've seen in the news and all over just the extraordinary energy and power demands that, you know, all these GPT calls and copilots and Gen AI just becoming part of our lives. The strain that that's putting on the power grid and energy consumption. How do you view that, and what do you see the future of the field? Kind of how do you see the field addressing that?
Yes, it's so complicated. I've worried about this my whole career because, you know, you teach these enormous classes and you have students do really large experiments and they do ambitious things. Stanford students tend to do very ambitious things. And I would think a lot about the energy consumption that was happening there. I do think there is some potential for benefits of centralization. If more of us were using models via APIs on the web, then we might just have one very energy intensive model running that all of us are using. And I think we could benefit in the same way that you benefit from centralizing transportation networks and so forth. But that's a difficult calculus. The other thing I could say is that people at Stanford, again, because we don't have the money to train these enormous models like in industry, we've been working really hard to make much smaller models effective, models that could run on a phone with very low energy, very low bandwidth, all that stuff. And so I think pursuing that is going to lead to some gains here. But also, again, I have to balance that with the fact that undoubtedly this is a societal problem. I do just have some faith that lots of smart people across from hardware, technology, all those people will participate in making progress.
Yeah, and I would note it's not just the energy demands, it's also for a lot of, you know, application use cases. Some of these large, massive models, they can't run on your phone, or the latency is too high. And so I'm really excited by the research Chris has been doing and others in the NLP group around how do we build systems that can leverage, you know, LLMs more as language compute and not be tied to, you know, the newest model or the biggest model. I got word we have time actually for one more question. So this one is maybe a little bit of a nuanced one. But Chris, many of us have been chatting with ChatGPT, or we've been asking AI for help on summarizing us or giving us information, and it always responds with, you know, a well-reasoned answer. But what we don't see is like, what is it excluding from the answer, or what is it not telling us? Is there any effort that you know of to explore or detect or be, you know, provide a little bit more interpretability behind, you know, what is the model not telling us?
Yes. Oh, so I think interpretability, it's been a major focus of my research, and I think it's an important frontier for artificial intelligence because at some level, if we can't explain how these systems are behaving and making decisions, we shouldn't regard them as safe, right? And the standard there has to be that we kind of understand at least the parameters in which they can safely operate, which implies deeply understanding their mechanisms. And I do think that we're going to uncover some surprising things. Here's a quick example of that. People are working very hard to make models safer by preventing them from generating problematic responses, biased responses, responses that might leak national security information and things like that. interpretability research is showing that even when we work very hard to suppress all those behaviors are still there. They are still latently a capacity of the model, and that means that people are going to find ways around them. And so there is going to be a kind of arms race as we suppress, but then find that we haven't successfully actually removed the problematic thing.
Yeah. Well, I think if there's one thing that is clear from the presentation and this Q&A is that this is still an ever-evolving field. We, as Chris said, we are at base camp. So we've made it really high and the air is thin, but we're not at the peak yet. And we've got a ways to go. So I'm so thankful that we've got people like Chris and other incredible researchers and thinkers and leaders at Stanford who are helping us get to the peak. And Chris, thank you so much for the presentation and your time and sharing your perspective.
Thank you, Morris, and it was great to see you.